Let's go to number 8. She's Moonlight has a question, says, I've heard some people say that psychology belongs to Satan and that Christians should stray from studying it. What is your opinion, and is there any biblical basis for not studying it? So this is kind of a complicated issue because in a broad sense, psychology, there's a sense in which it's like just learning about what are common behaviors, common ways of thinking, and common types of treatment that will help people, or at least give them perceived help, to do better, at least meet their own goals in those areas. Is that inherently evil? Like, no, that doesn't seem that bad. Like, maybe that's kind of healthy. I mean, in a sense, pastors do this please listen to me carefully, in a sense. I'm not saying pastors are psychologists, because they're not, but in a sense they do this because what will happen is somebody comes to them with an issue and they give them advice or counsel, right? And they watch how it plays out. But that same pastor, 30 years later, he's dealt with that kind of person like dozens of times, and he's changed the way he gives counsel now. He's learned from experience that for that scenario, it might be better to advise them this way. Even though what he said was true, it may not have been the most helpful for that person. So there's an element of this like kind of experimentally learning as you go, as you give counsel and advice. But like I said, it's complicated. That's not really what people are complaining about when they talk about psychology. What they're talking about is like the thought makers within psychology. So it's not just the fact of psychology, I think. It's the way it's being done. And so you have like thought makers in psychology. So you have like Freud, who had particular beliefs about how psychology took place. And it's been years since I've looked into this, but there was like Freud, then there was like the Rogerian style of psychology. These are different sort of paradigms for how human psychology works. And when you start doing that, you're not just looking at how do I help somebody reach their goals and deal with sort of the different stresses they have and different issues they got going on. But you're also looking at how will I view them? Like, I'm going to take a worldview now of what a human is and what makes them tick, and I'm going to place that over the person, and it might be an unbiblical worldview. I'll give you one quick example that comes to mind. It's been too long since I've studied these things. But one example would be the nature versus nurture debate. And so like Freud was very much into the nature thing, or the nurture thing, excuse me. So Sigmund Freud, who was a weirdo, okay? But a lot of the weirdos are the people who end up spending their whole life doing all these experiments and writing it all down, and then everybody talks about them forever. So Sigmund Freud was on a number of different levels. He was a very strange, weird person, you know, and he thought like, you know, every man wants to like sleep with his mother and he wants to kill his father, and weird stuff. He also would teach that a lot of your current behaviors as an adult would come from stuff that happened when you were a baby. Now, I'm not saying none of that's the case, but he seemed to lean on that very heavily. He was very much, as far as I can recall, on the nurture side of the debate. Then there's others who are on the nature side of the debate. Oh, you're predisposed, you're inclined towards this sort of thing. Is it your life experiences that I should focus on, or is it sort of like your genetics and your DNA and, you know, your nature? But there's another side of the debate, which is the spiritual. And I think nature matters and nurture does matter. They both matter, but there's a spiritual side of things. And this is where, when I enter into the room of a psychologist, they're supposed to set aside like strong moral commitments, to my understanding, and they're supposed to utilize the tools that they've been given to assess and advise, as very little advice is given actually, really, to help people work through things. This is you're an experiment in a sense when you step into the psychologist's office, but they're going to target things. Like, some will focus all on your childhood and all on past traumas because they're going to think that all these past traumas have to be worked through because it's all very nurture oriented. All this stuff is a deep experiment in your psyche, and it can go good and it can go bad. But because for many psychologists, they're being informed by worldview things, like it's just nature nurture, and there's no sort of God or his rules or genuine spiritual battles that a person goes through or truth about Christ, like none of that's involved, it can be weird. So I think this is the where at least I would say there's some legitimate criticisms against psychology. So all that being said, to make it more complicated, every psychologist is different. Just because they went in school and they went through these things in school doesn't mean that in the actual psychologist's office, like I know one guy who has a psychologist who the psychologist constantly gives him advice. You need to do this and you need to do that and you need to do this with his life. Tells him what he just should do. And I'm like, that's not very psychologist-y of him. This doesn't seem very typical. It doesn't seem like they're training to do that. But people do what they want to do. Your psychologist could be a godly, grounded Christian who's learned a lot from the psychological experiments others have done, but has incorporated a Christian worldview. Or they could be ungodly, pointing you in weird directions. They could be turning you into a narcissist because everything's so about you and you're so obsessed with yourself. Or they could be helping you work through some really difficult things that a lot of other people don't have the equipment to help you process. I don't know. So here's me. I throw my hands up in the air and I say, I don't have a judgment on psychology like a giant blanket I can drop on it. I just know you're messing with people on a deep level, kind of like with surgery. Mike, do you think surgery is good or bad? I think surgery is potentially really good and potentially very dangerous. It depends on how good your surgeon is. That's the same thing with psychology, except with psychology, it's a lot harder to measure the effects because you might feel better. Like I know one girl who went to a psychologist totally became a narcissist. Does that mean every psychologist will do that to people? No, I don't think it means that. I just think that's what happened with that person because their way of coping with all the trauma and whatever else they were dealing with was to just become more and more self-obsessed. And that's unfortunate. It helped in some ways, but in other ways it hurt. So like, yeah, how good is the psychologist? Well, I don't know. I don't know. So forgive me, I've somewhat rambled. I don't think you can give a one giant blanket answer to this question, except to recognize that, like, say, with certain medical procedures, it's a question of, well, is it being done well? Is it a good procedure? Is it really needed for me? And is the surgeon doing it actually good at his job? And with psychology, those questions are a lot harder to answer than they are with just normal medicine. So with psychology, yeah, you may find great help. And there's some Christian psychologists probably doing great work. So I don't want to cast them all out. Yeah. Anyway, there's my thoughts on that. Something for you guys to think about, accept, reject, tweak. Let me back up real quick and just say this. You say, is there any biblical basis for studying psychology? I will say this, is the Bible does seem to reveal there's these deep emotional and idea issues that humans have, right? This is in scripture continually, whether it's like in the book of Psalms, like the depth of a person's soul crying out to God, I'm in great despair and I'm going through hard times. God is seen as a major solution to these sorts of problems. And that's important. And if your psychology doesn't include God at all, then it's missing something important. When you look at things like rejoice always, and the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds. Be thankful, be anxious for nothing, right? But in everything give thanks and make your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God will guard your heart. Like there's things in scripture like that. Yeah, how do I handle my anxiety? Okay, I'm going to stop and I'm going to try and be deliberately thankful about things. This seems to me kind of like psychological stuff that's happening in scripture. Doesn't mean there's no other answers, but these are at least some available answers to Christians.